Celebrating and Taking Charge of ADHD is an innovative group coaching program incorporating mindfulness as an essential tool throughout. This podcast addresses a number of topics that we face on a day-to-day basis and celebrates the precious human life we have all been given.
Welcome to Celebrating ADHD podcast. Today I'm joined by Sarah Bickers, who is a professional organizer and also teaches other organizers how to work with ADHD clients. So we're going to really look at the topic of decluttering and why it is so essential to our lives. So welcome, Sarah.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Sue.
Let's maybe start with a bit of background. What's your experience of ADHD?
Well, it pretty much runs through my family like a stick of rock, I always say. So I have ADHD. I have two sons with ADHD. I have a sister with ADHD, and I think I counted 4 nieces with ADHD. So there's a lot of us in our family. And I first started to wonder whether I might have ADHD when my first son was diagnosed, and I sat with him through the assessment process and the penny began to drop. I thought, actually, I have all these challenges that they're asking him about, and actually what I've done is I've developed loads of coping strategies over the years to deal with them. So I had a lot of challenges around working memory and focus, and I think I learned when I was quite young, when I was in the 6th form, that if I was interested in something, then I would focus really well. And if I wasn't interested, it was very hard for me to keep my focus. So I was initially thinking about doing a German degree and very quickly realized that I wasn't interested in studying books. I just wanted to speak German. So sort of recognizing where my interest lay was one of my coping strategies, essentially, for managing my undiagnosed ADHD. And in those days, that was back in the 80s, we really didn't know very much about ADHD. So it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I finally got diagnosed. And one of the triggers for going for assessment was that I hit the menopause. And in common with many other women, my working memory got worse and I wasn't sleeping well. So that affected just my general function, and I began to realize that I kind of reached this critical tipping point where my ADHD symptoms I was struggling to manage them. So for years I'd sort of thought, I've got the traits of ADHD, but I don't feel like I'm really suffering enough. And at that point went for assessment, and at the same time HRT, because I realize now that HRT, having a low estrogen, also affects our dopamine function. So that was partly why the wheels were coming off the bus, so to speak. So so that was a couple of years ago, and since then I've been on treatment, and it was a big shock for me, really, how it was like suddenly realizing, oh my goodness, this is what it's like for other people, just functioning at a more normal level and not having to try so hard and work so hard. And I felt like all my life, actually, I've been working really, really hard to, cope with my symptoms and manage my symptoms and them not affect my life. So felt like taking a big, deep sigh of relief having that diagnosis. So
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. You mentioned about working memory. How did that show up in your life?
I've got a terrible verbal working memory. And I think part of that was around paying attention. So there's that kind of element of, are you paying attention enough when somebody's telling you something? And the other bit was just pure and simple, not being able to hold more than 1 or 2 things in mind. So if somebody gave me directions somewhere, if they wrote it down or if they showed me, I could get a visual sense of what it was looking like. But if they just told me, I would remember maybe the first 1 instruction, maybe 2 at a pinch. And after that, it was all gone. And just a funny kind of example of how it affects me in my day-to-day life, you know, I leave things out all the time as a kind of reminder, you know, that kind of out of sight is out of mind. So I would keep something out as a reminder, oh, I've got to pay that bill or do this thing. And my husband, who doesn't like visual clutter, he would put it away in a drawer. He'd be like, oh, we've got people coming around, I'm just going to tuck this away in the drawer. And then it was like it was gone forever. I had no recollection of it ever being there. And then maybe 6 months down the line, I'd open that drawer and be like, oh no, I was meant to do something about that. So we've had to negotiate a solution for that, which is usually him putting things on my desk if I've left them out and it's bugging him. Then I still have them out of sight, out in plain sight, so that I can take action on them.
You mentioned about when we spoke before the podcast about this hoarding disorder and ADHD. How are they connected?
Okay, so there is research that shows that people with ADHD have a higher propensity to have hoarding disorder. And hoarding disorder, people often have a misunderstanding about hoarding disorder. They think it's about having a lot of stuff. And of course it is, but there are plenty of people out there who have a lot of stuff because they haven't had time to sort of sort through it, or they've just lived a long life and just gradually accumulated stuff. And actually, if they give the time and attention to it, they're really happy to kind of declutter that stuff. With hoarding disorder, it's actually a mental health condition. So it's not just, people call themselves hoarders, but actually to be diagnosed with hoarding disorder, there has to be a sort of there's some specific criteria. So for example, not being able to use a room for its purpose, its intended purpose. So for example, not being able to sleep in your bedroom, not being able to use a living room, or in extreme cases, not being able to use a kitchen or a bathroom. And, you know, I have worked in homes like that where, you know, the kitchen's piled up with paperwork and there's no cooking that happens in the kitchen. Or if there is cooking, it's quite unsafe, obviously. So hoarding disorder is about not being able to use a room for its intended purpose, also a kind of distress around letting go of things. So I would say, like, one of the easiest indicators for me that somebody has hoarding disorder is generally at the end of a session with somebody, you know what it's like when you declutter a space. It feels really nice, doesn't it? It's like really liberating. And my business name up until this point has been Free Your Space, because my work has been about, you know, freeing your space, giving yourself more breathing space, really. But somebody with hoarding disorder, when that space is clear, it can be quite distressing for them. So at the end of that session, they could feel traumatized, particularly if it's not dealt with sensitively. So, you know, if for example, somebody tries to help their mum or their aunt who's got a hoarding disorder and does a big clear out, it can be really traumatic for that person. Actually, it can set them back a lot, because the stuff around them is not a problem for them. It's their solution to the problem. It's like a bandage that they're wrapping around themselves. So just to take off that bandage without dealing with the underlying mental health issue can be really traumatic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. So are you saying that even clearing the stuff, there's a psychological effect that if not dealt with can cause a kind of trauma?
Yeah, definitely. So actually somebody with hoarding disorder, like as a professional organizer, the best case scenario is they're actually having psychological support while you're working with them. So it's a kind of multi-agency approach. Quite often social services may be involved, and ideally a psychologist or a psychiatrist will be supporting the client through that process as well. You know, just doing a clear out is not the solution for hoarding disorder. In fact, it can make things a whole lot worse. People can, you know, very quickly they'll fill the space again because the underlying issue hasn't been dealt with. However, what I would say is that, you know, I've worked in lots of homes people with ADHD who've got very full homes, and it might look a little bit like hoarding disorder. So it can be very full, very cluttered. And actually, once they get going, they can be quite ruthless and make decisions quite quickly, be really happy to let go of stuff. So that's where the kind of issue lies, is that quite often, you know, in the media, we think about hoarding disorder as being just about having loads of stuff. And it's definitely not. It's about how we connect with our stuff, how we, you know, how we feel about letting go of things.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, with ADHD, there are lots of reasons why hoarding disorder might be associated. So, you know, difficulty making decisions. Often people with ADHD may have experienced some trauma in the past, and that's often associated with hoarding disorder. If there's been a loss, a significant loss in early life, or there's been a significant trauma, both those things can be associated. At the other extreme, where it's not hoarding disorder and it's just a lot of stuff, you know, we know that we find it difficult sometimes to make decisions, or we find it difficult to manage our time. We tend to be quite all or nothing, don't we? So we kind of throw ourselves into projects, then we don't have time to manage our homes. So, you know, I've worked with people who've been very high functioning at work, and then at home it's like nothing's happening at home in terms of maintenance. So, you know, there's lots of reasons why people with ADHD might have a lot of clutter in their home.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really great to be speaking to you at this time, because it's something that I've been interested in, the process of decluttering and studying minimalism for some time. And it's one thing knowing the theory of it, but actually putting it into practice, I'm still struggling with it. And perhaps we could, maybe you could enlighten me with some tips along the way. Because what's going on at the moment is that everything where I've been living has been moved out of the house and downsized into a smaller area. And as you were mentioning, it's about the connections of things. I start to see that is that there's things that I'm attached to and I don't want to let them go. And one of the things is with clothes. How would you suggest to address that?
Well, first of all, I'd say again, that's probably not hoarding disorder. That's probably just our natural human tendency to collect, which is very much part of the human condition. You know, many of us collect stuff over time. And we also have this element, psychological element, I think it's called the endowment principle, where we become attached to something. So, you know, and this happens with very young children. If you give them a toy or something, that they'll be attached to that particular toy that you've given them, and it has a kind of extra quality because it belongs to them. So, you know, we endow belongings, we endow the things around us with an extra element of meaning, if you like. So, you know, you've worn an outfit, say, to Glastonbury, and then that outfit becomes your Glastonbury outfit, and you think about it with fondness, and you're like, oh, I remember that weekend, that you know. So there's that kind of sentimental element that sometimes connects us with things, and then there's, you know, all sorts of things like, you know, practicality. So, for example, you know, we've all been in lockdown over the last couple of years. People haven't been going out as much. They've got, you know, maybe somebody's got a ball gown, maybe you've got a ball gown hanging up somewhere, and you're like, I'm not going to be using it anytime soon, but when I do need it, what am I going to do? Am I going to have to go out and buy another ball gown? So with clothes, I think there's so many different layers, and I think with everything you're decluttering, there's things to explore, different criteria, if you like, to explore. So, you know, for example, does it fit you? And a lot of people keep clothes because they hope they're going to get into them again. So they've maybe put on weight and they're like, well, you know, I really love that, but it doesn't fit me. And they just put it back in their wardrobe and hope that one day they'll be able to squeeze back into it. And to me, I often think a piece of clothing like that is no longer a part of your active wardrobe. So I think of things in terms of what's your active wardrobe about, and if something's not part of your active wardrobe, where are you going to store it? Does it need to go in the wardrobe, for example? You were mentioning about putting things in storage, which is something that as a professional organizer, we're always a little bit twitchy about things going into storage, because it can be a kind of form of procrastination, can't it? And we see this, sometimes with people with hoarding disorder. What will happen is the house will get really full, and then they'll start putting stuff into storage, or they'll buy another property and start filling up that space. But there are, I think, you described your example as being one where you're putting stuff into storage because you'll be moving somewhere with more space at some point in the future. So that's a good example of using storage appropriately. When you come back to that storage unit and start unpacking stuff, whenever it is, whether it's in 6 months' time or 2 years' time, things will feel different because you haven't looked at them for a long time. So, and sometimes that can be helpful because it gives you a little bit of distance and perspective. You come back to that stuff and you're like, actually, why am I keeping that? I haven't needed it for the last 2 years. I haven't missed it. Or maybe you're thinking you've got a new space, you want it to feel different to how your old space felt. So you've got a kind of different vision to when you last had your clothes in a wardrobe. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do see that. I think that's a really good insight, actually, in terms of what you mentioned about getting to the root cause of it. As I start to delve into it, a lot of it with the clothes is linked to validation, because it's about having the right outfit for the right occasion. And because there's so many different occasions that come into life, that's hence why it's just sort of grown. And then, if I look at something, I probably haven't worn it in the last 6 months, so I don't really need it. But then this little inner voice says, yeah, but you might need it in the future.
And that's a real challenge, isn't it? Because, there is stuff that I always say, if you're not prepared to feel regret, you're probably not ready to declutter. And the reason I say that is because if you do a lot of decluttering, you will make the odd mistake every now and again. You'll declutter something, and then, a week later, a month later, maybe 2 years later, you think, I could have really done with that now. And actually being unable to cope with that regret is one reason that people with hoarding disorder struggle, that kind of inability to forgive themselves for, maybe they made 100 decisions that were really good decisions, and then they'll just focus on that one decision where they decluttered something, and they'll say to themselves, right, I'm not going to do that again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. It does, absolutely. But it's really like what you said about the Band-Aid thing. I can see that once you go delve deeper into the psychological thing, is that it does go back into the past, because there was an incident in childhood where I think I was about 8 years old and got invited to a party, and it was a party with a very popular girl, and I was very chuffed to be invited. That's the number one. And then the next thing was, what do you wear? And I'm not going to blame Mum for this, because it's we have to forgive, and I have forgiven her for this. That what was experienced is that when I turned up to the party, everyone was dressed in these sort of leggings that was there at the time, or the fashion, and I was dressed in an old-fashioned dress. And the humiliation that I experienced, because kids can be cruel, can't they? And they were just very nasty. And that left an imprint that I can't turn up to anything without being in the right attire.
And that's, it's really interesting hearing you say that, Sue, because, we're both ADHD coaches. And, one of the powerful things about coaching is kind of sometimes looking back to be able to move forwards. So to kind of recognize that, and then to be able to ask yourself, where am I now? How resourceful am I? How will I cope in such and such a situation? And kind of to explore who you are now. rather than sort of feel stuck in that place where you were before. And, I think decluttering, I mean, first of all, I have to say, decluttering in this country, the profession of decluttering has been around since about 2004, which is when APDO was set up, which is this Association of Professional Declutterers and Organisers. So people are always surprised that there's an organisation there, but there is. And when I first joined, which was in 2014, 8 years ago, just over 8 years ago, everyone was talking about decluttering, and now most of us would call ourselves professional organisers, because first of all, it's not just about how much stuff you have. Sometimes people need help organising, even though they don't have loads of clutter, they still need to get organised. So it's much broader than just clutter. The other element is that it's never just about the stuff. It's always about our sort of beliefs or connections to our belongings, and kind of unpicking some of that stuff and questioning it. So that was what took me into coaching, really, because I knew that I wanted to be able to ask my clients the powerful questions that would enable them to start letting go of stuff, and sort of imagining a different way of living. And you talked about minimalism and that kind of journey towards minimalism, and I would say my whole life has been a journey towards simplicity. I'm not really a minimalist at all. I have clutter in my home, or rather I have stuff in my home, plenty of decorations and stuff. It's not about living with 20 items of clothing or anything like that. That doesn't interest me at all. For me, it's much more about living more simply. And I think even as a teenager, I was really drawn to living more simply. I was really interested in the Mennonite community in America and their kind of simpler lifestyle. Really, I mean, I wasn't interested in the sort of religious side of it, but I was really interested in that kind of simplicity, and I was drawn towards it from a very young age. And that's been my journey, really. That's brought me to becoming a professional organizer in 2014. And I recognized it as part of my managing my ADHD, was recognizing that, as the minimalists say, you don't need more space, you need less stuff, because the stuff needs looking after, doesn't it? And with ADHD, that's a lot of effort. So like, if we can make it easier for ourselves, why not? So that's been my kind of journey, if you like, into professional organizing, and now into coaching, to go a little bit deeper and help people, discard not just the stuff, but some of the attitudes and, mindsets that hold us back often.
Yeah, no, that's great. So what I'm hearing is it's not just about the physical side of it. There's a psychological element to this process of decluttering. What are the main benefits? Why is it so important for us to pay attention to this as ADHD sufferers?
Interesting question. So yeah, I mean, for me, it comes back to the simplicity element of it. I think, the more stuff we have to manage, the more stuff we have to remember where we keep it. And the fewer you're living in a smaller space right now, and I'm guessing that's quite a lot easier for you to manage, is it, on a day-to-day level?
It is unbelievable, and I can give you an example with the cleaning. So we used to live in a three story townhouse, and I had a real issue with the cleaning, actually doing everything. I found it very overwhelming. And now, living in the converted lorry, it's just one room, and you can do the cleaning in an hour or two. That's it, done. And it feels so much better. It feels lighter. It feels rewarding. You get much more satisfaction from it, that you've accomplished it within the time frame.
And I would say I've listened to a few of the minimalists being interviewed on TV and on some of the programs that are there, and I've always kind of wondered whether there's a higher instance of ADHD within the minimalist community, whether people are sort of drawn towards minimalism out of that kind of feeling of overwhelm and, you know, what can I do to make my life simple and more manageable? I'm going to get rid of all the stuff. And, you know, so it's kind of really interesting to me that, you know, just to hear people talking, minimalists often talk about how overwhelmed they felt, how out of control they felt, how they were spending all their time on managing their home or managing their finances. And I've always been about, right, how can we simplify this? What's an easier way of doing this? Because life, for me, life's too short to be cleaning or, you know, managing all of that clutter. So I actually now really enjoy decluttering. And, you know, if I kind of decide, right, I'm going to sort out the shed, I get a lot of satisfaction from doing it, because it's that sense of feeling like, oh, I've got rid of all the excess that you're not using, that you don't love, that is broken, or, you know, a job to do in inverted commas. And you're focusing in on who you are now, what you need right now, and making sure that your life fits you and who you are. And for me, that's my motivation, is how can I create my space to fit who I am right now. And there's actually a really great book which I often recommend to people sort of my age and above, so I'm in my 50s, and I've got to get the name right. I think it's called The Art of Swedish Death Cleaning, but you can check and put a little note under the podcast if I've got that wrong. And it sounds really dramatic, and I think that's why they chose to call it that. But in Sweden, death cleaning, the idea of death cleaning is basically, I guess we would translate it as putting your affairs in order. And people in Sweden apparently start doing this from about the time their children leave home. So, you know, it's that idea that if you leave it till you're really, really old, then it becomes a massive, horrible job to do, or, you know, you're leaving that job to somebody else after you're gone. If you do it when you're younger, then you're really making sure that your space and your life fits you. And so, you know, the writer talks about sort of making the decisions that she wants to make about who gets certain piece of furniture or photographs or whatever, and she gets to have agency in that and make those decisions, but also to make sure that her space is working really well for what she's interested in now, rather than being a kind of massive, complex, cluttered time capsule of everything she's ever done in her life, which is what our homes often represent, isn't it? They're sort of telling a long historical story. Well, I made the decision a while ago that I wanted my home to kind of represent mostly the here and now. And, you know, it's not that we don't have, I love photos. So I've got photos, mostly digital now, but you know, I've kept things. I'm quite a sentimental person, which always surprises people. So I've kept things that are really meaningful to me, but not everything that's ever meant anything to me. Just the stuff that's really meaningful to me now.
No, that's interesting. I mean, you mentioned photos. I mean, I love photography, and I just, even when I think about it, there's so many photos now going to digital. So I mean, when we're looking at decluttering, there's so many things to declutter. There's emails to declutter. There's the home. You mentioned the finances. So how do we get started?
Well, you know, that's a massive question. So I guess that's going to vary depending on who we are and what we want to focus on. And so it's about working out what our immediate goals are and starting there. So for one person, it might be making their bedroom, sort of bringing their bedroom back to a sort of haven rather than just a place where they've kind of dumped stuff. It might be about reclaiming a spare room. It might be making their living room fit who they are. It might be about managing their paperwork so that you can put your hands on any piece of paper you're looking for within a couple of minutes, which is, you know, one of my kind of goals with my paperwork, is kind of find things really easily. So it's always going to depend on the person. And the work that I do is very person-centered, obviously. So that's a starting point. I have to say, like, my top tip for a very, very cluttered space, if you live in one of those homes that's got to the point where it feels like it's all been stirred up with a giant spoon, which is something that I come across quite a bit in ADHD homes. I used to start by kind of working my way geographically around a room. So I'd sort of start at one door, work my way around and come to the other side. And over time, I've realized that's quite a lot of work and mental effort, because you're shifting your effort maybe from a piece of paper to a piece of clothing to a cup. There could be all sorts of things you're coming across on your journey. And every time you have to shift your attention from one, material to another, you use a different set of criteria. So, like, for example, if you're sorting through your wardrobe, you use you'd ask yourself different questions. So if you're sorting through your paperwork. So now what I do is in a room like that or a space like that, I'll often encourage a big sort, first of all. And that involves no mental effort at all. It's just literally a sort. So you might, for example, go around the room with a bin liner and say, right, I'm just going to give myself 10 minutes and pick up all the rubbish I can find and throw that away. And then you might say, right, I'm going to pick up all the pieces of paper I can find, every pile of paperwork in this room, and I'm going to put it all on that table. And any clothes that I find are going to go on the bed, and any books I find are going to go by the bookshelf. And that kind of sorting is very low mental energy. So you're not having to make decisions, which are the exhausting thing. You're just doing that first sort. So then you immediately feel more in control because you've got the big categories there sorted. And then you might want to then go into one of those categories and break it down a little bit more. So you have to be able to accept, if you're dealing with a space like that, you have to be able to accept it's not all going to be done in 3 hours. So you're going to have to live with a different kind of clutter. The clutter is going to be organized clutter. You're going to have all your huge piles of paperwork in one area and huge piles of books somewhere. And then the next stage will be to go and choose one of those categories and look at the questions that are going to enable you to let go of things in that space.
Yeah, that's the key thing, isn't it? The letting go is going to be there's going to be different questions for different areas. So let's say finances, for example. What kind of questions would you ask yourself?
Well, finances. Do you talk about financial paperwork?
Yeah. Let's say financial paperwork.
Yeah. So, one of the big questions for paperwork in general is, what am I keeping this for? Because we often keep paperwork because it looks official. So we feel like we ought to keep it. So, for example, utility bills, people often feel like they ought to keep utility bills. And I always say to people, what are you keeping it for? And if they say, oh, I don't know, I feel like I ought to, I'd say, what would it be like if you didn't have these at all? If they were gone, how would that feel? And often people will say, actually, it'd be quite a relief, not to have this big pile of papers to sort through. Sometimes people will say to me, well, maybe I'd like to compare one utility provider from another, and I need to be able to look at my records. And then we'll kind of work out what their criteria are. So they might say, actually, I only need to keep the last year's worth of paperwork for that utility. Before that, I don't need it. So they've changed their criteria from, I'm going to keep all the paperwork, to actually, I'm only going to keep the last year's of utility bills or the last year's of paper bank accounts. And obviously, challenging that assumption that we need to keep paper versions, can be helpful, to set up online accounts as much as possible. But for some of us with ADHD, we like to be able to put our hands on the paper. So if that's the case, how far back do you have to go? Can you shift your rules that you've had from, going to keep everything because I think that's what I ought to do? Obviously, sometimes with financial paperwork, there are reasons to keep things, for example, tax receipts and things like that. If you've not got a digital version of them, you need to keep them up to 7 years if you're self-employed. So there are specific criteria that you need to check on before you make a decision to discard stuff. But on the whole, most of us need a lot less paperwork than we're collecting. So my particular weakness is notes that I write. I scribble down a note and then so every now and again I have a good clear out and make sure that I'm not keeping stuff, or I've kept it, I put it on a document or something like that, so I don't need to keep the paper.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. The notes, I'm always taking notes and think, oh yeah, I'll keep them, and then it's just asking that question, what am I keeping them for? Have I consolidated the information, and am I applying it to my life? Why would I keep it?
And actually, if you can't find a note that you're looking for, it's not serving you in any way, is it? So if you've got a massive pile of notes, you've got notes all over the place, they're not helping you. There's no benefit to them whatsoever.
Yeah.
But for example, if you were looking at something like clothes, one of my favorite questions with clothes is, would you buy it if it was in a shop right now at full price? Because often that really focuses you, and you look at it and you're like, actually, I don't like it that much. I've just kept it because of that kind of attachment stuff that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so, I like that. Would you buy it again?
If it was here right now, hanging on a shop rail in front of you, that can be an interesting question.
We tend to, we're prone to being impulsive shoppers that see it there and we think that's what I need, and you start justifying it in your head. Oh, I need it, and then you get it home, and then you may not wear it at all. And things change, like you said. And I like what you said about that, really kind of press refresh and say, well, look, what is your life right now, and what do you need to facilitate your life now as it is? Because things have changed. I'm not an 80-year-old going to a party trying to impress people anymore, because I've learned that, why to worry what people think. It's pointless.
But really, I think, sorry, I interrupted you, Sue.
No, I think it's you have to review your behavior and really bring it back down to earth, and look at what's relevant right now.
I think one of the challenges with decluttering in general is that, each of us only has so many decisions we can make in a day. And there's a certain amount of evidence that the further on in the day we go, the worse our decision making gets. And sometimes my role as a professional organizer is to put the brakes on with somebody. And with a few of my ADHD clients, I come across what I call the ADHD toss, which is when people get they go into that kind of impulsive, okay, I'm in the mode now, I don't need that, and they're throwing everything away. And actually, holding on to everything or letting go of everything, both of those are abdicating our decision making. In both cases, we can challenge ourselves a little bit. So if we're the sort of person who holds on to everything, perhaps we can challenge a few of those decisions and just stretch our boundaries a little bit. If we're throwing everything out, sometimes that has an impact. That's kind of another form of ADHD tax, isn't it? Because you throw something away impulsively, you haven't thought about whether actually you're going to need it in 6 months' time. So you don't need it right now, but you might need it in 6 months' time. So there are situations where I will question people discarding something. So for example, if it's really expensive and it doesn't take up too much space, making a decision to throw something out, I'll say to them, would you ever wear this again? They'll be like, well, so it's a ball gown. Well, yes, I might do, and it's going to cost me a lot of money to buy another one. They might decide to actually keep that if they've got the space to keep it, or if it's, say, an expensive piece of equipment. Discarding it might not be the right thing to do. So essentially, decluttering is about decision making, and that's why it's a challenge for us with ADHD. Because we are, it's partly about the fact that we see so many opportunities. So we collect lots of things. We often have lots of hobbies or things that we've tried out and then got bored with. So there's so many reasons why clutter is a challenge for us.
Yeah. And that leads on to the next question, is that it's okay to get help with this. So where would you advise people to go to get help?
Well, I would say wherever you go, make sure you find somebody who's non-judgmental. So often the first port of call is a friend or family member. Quite often it's somebody who's really, really organized, who's just itching to get their hands on, your stuff, or they're like, why on earth does she keep all of that stuff? I could help her clear all of that stuff out. And actually, I often come across clients who've had that experience first, and it can be quite traumatic. So they have this session with this well-meaning friend, and by the end of the day, they're exhausted and a little bit traumatized because they've kind of been bullied into making decisions. And a professional organizer should never put pressure on you to make a decision. If you're not ready to make a decision about something, actually, normally it's best to wait and come back to that later on. Like with your example about the storage unit, it will nearly always be easier to make the decision the second time you look at it. So the first thing is to find somebody who's non-judgmental. And, if you've got a friend, anybody who can help you, by all means, take advantage of that. Having somebody who's really supportive and non-judgmental might be all you need. I think we're often aware with ADHD that we don't want to kind of impose too much on other people. And if it's a very cluttered home, then it can be quite an investment in time, to ask a friend to keep coming back and doing stuff. So that's often when people will prefer to use a professional organizer, or perhaps they want somebody who will help them a little bit more with planning organizational strategies for moving forwards, because our job is very much not just about the decluttering. It's very much about how can we look at how you're managing your clothes, for example, how you're managing your laundry, to make that work better for you, make your wardrobe work better for you, so that you can put your hands on the belts easily, so that you can find a pair of knickers without having to rummage through a massive drawer. It's about making your home or your living space work better for you.
Yeah, that's great. So where would I go to get some help? And how can people find you?
Yeah. So basically, the first place that I'd encourage people to look at is the APDO website. So that's APDO. There is a Find an Organizer button on that website. You can put in your postcode. If you have ADHD, you can put in ADHD as a specialism. And then I always say, have a look at a few different people in your area, speak to a few of them, get a feel of how you connect with them. It's similar to coaching, really. We need to have a good connection with the person who's coming in and like literally looking at our knickers drawer or our bank statements. You need to know you can trust them. You need to be able to have fun with them, enjoy the process. So actually doing a little bit of shopping at that point, talking to a few people, and trust your instincts. I think that's an important element. Often with ADHD, we'll go with the first person we come across because we're like, oh, it's another decision to make. But I would just encourage you to talk with maybe 2 or 3 people off that list who you have a sort of instinctive reaction towards. And that's often how people come to me. They're like, oh, I looked at your website and I just thought, this is the kind of person I want to work with. So yeah.
Great. And they can find you free your space.
Yes, they can, although I have got a waiting list at the moment. So that's why I said start off by going to APDO. So yeah, and part of the reason that I've been doing this training with organisers for the last 3 years is because I'm like, it's not just me. I want there to be a choice. I want people to be able to pick not just me, but somebody else who's got experience with ADHD and isn't phased, and can work with you, alongside with you. And it's very collaborative. So if somebody's looking for an ADHD friendly organizer, and you speak to somebody who starts telling you their method of how to do it, I would steer clear. I would go for somebody who's prepared to listen, find out how you tick, and collaboratively work with you to find a way forward that's going to fit you and your brain.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. And yeah, it's great what you're doing is teaching other professional organisers how to work with ADHD clients, because it is so misunderstood, isn't it? So that's brilliant. Well, look, the final question I guess I have for you is that with ADHD, we kind of know that decluttering is something that we need to do, or we even want to do sometimes, but there is this feeling of overwhelm and procrastination. How would you inspire someone to embark on this journey?
I normally just talk with people, and when I talk with people, we'll find a way in. So there'll be one particular thing that's really bugging them. So if I go to somebody's house and they're like, I don't know where to start, I feel really overwhelmed with all of this stuff, we might look at what's going to make the biggest difference to them. A question I often ask is that miracle question. If we could wave a magic wand in your home and just touch one space, what space would you choose, and what would that look like? How would that feel? And explore that. And sometimes there'll be more than one thing people come up with that's ADHD for you, and then we'll be like, just pick one. Let's just start with one and get going. And it might be as simple as your knicker drawer or the kitchen, that kind of junk drawer that everybody has. Let's just empty that out, take everything out, throw away all the things you don't want, put back the stuff that you need, make it work better for you. And I think that's one of the challenges with decluttering, isn't it, is that it feels so big and overwhelming. And actually, when we start breaking it down to just one drawer or one shelf of a bookshelf, and just say to ourselves, I'm just going to start the process. With ADHD, we're often focused on the results, aren't we? The sort of sense of failure that the clutter represents to us. Or we think if we can't do it all, there's no point in even starting. And I'm sure you do this, but I encourage all my clients to kind of look at the process and think, right, okay, if I'm going to start doing more decluttering, rather than thinking I'm going to become completely decluttered in a week, instead focus on, I'm going to practice the habit of decluttering. So that might mean every day I spend maybe 10 minutes doing one little space, sort of creating those new habits and, strengthening our decluttering muscle, essentially, by doing little bits all the time, can be great.
It is, isn't it? Because we're not talking about a one-off process here. We're talking about it's maybe a bigger decluttering session, but then there's a maintenance side to it to keep it up, because I can, well, that, really thank you for coming on and sharing the insights. I've got a lot from this, in terms of, you're inspiring me right now to go to the knicker drawer. Even though we've just gone through the process of cutting it down, I mean, what it would feel like in the morning, and just knowing where to go, and knowing that's it, that's what I'm going to wear, it would eliminate so much thinking about it, and you get frustrated, and to eliminate that's what it would be wonderful, to wake up in the morning and just not having to go through that decision making process, or knowing where to find it. Same with the kitchen as well, is when we're cooking, I love to cook, and it has to flow, and when it flows, I can make wonderful things. And it's all about what we put into the food, isn't it? And we're frustrated that we can't find a particular thing, then that's what we're putting into the food. So it's food for thought, what you've given us today. And I wish everyone to really embark on this journey, because it's the small stuff, don't sweat the small stuff. There's a big life out there. Spend the time doing other things if we get organized.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not, it's not just about the stuff. That's what I would say. Definitely.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome, Sue. It's lovely to join you and talk with you today.
Yeah. Any last comments you'd like to share?
Oh, do you know, the thing that sprung into my mind is decluttering's for life, not just for Christmas. And I think, you know, Marie Kondo, she had that idea. She often talks about how you only need to do it once. That's not been my personal experience. You know, maybe it is for some people, but I have ADHD. I do tend to accumulate stuff. So from time to time, I do a little sort out. But, you know, I live in a home that's not cluttered. It's not overly full. And every now and again, I'll have to tackle one area because it's got a little bit full up. And I'm like, okay, I want to get that back. I want to get that feeling of, you know, feeling in control and sorted and get on with my life. It doesn't take up a huge amount of my time anymore because I've, you know, gone through the process. And
it's great advice. And also forgiving ourselves as well.
Always.
It's that self-compassion.
Being kind. I think that's one of the most ADHD friendly principles, isn't it? Being kind to ourselves.
Right. On that note, I'm going to say thank you very much. And yeah, we'll hope to everyone gets on that journey of decluttering right now. Just pick a room.
Do it.
Thank you for downloading. You've been listening to the Celebrating ADHD podcast, empowering people to reach their full potential. Please follow us on the Celebrating ADHD Facebook page, Instagram and Twitter, or join the members area at www.celebratingadhd.com. We are already good enough the way we are. Celebrating ADHD works best combined as a holistic treatment program, so we advise you to consult your health specialist for medical advice. If you are not sure if you have ADHD, please get in touch as we can recommend a medical expert, as the diagnosis is all part of the journey.